The air tasted like wet pennies and kerosene. Sergeant Cole, known only as Ghost within the four-man long-range reconnaissance patrol, LRRP team, hadn't moved a muscle in 4 minutes, except for the frantic twitching of his eyelid. His finger rested lightly on the trigger guard of his AR-15, the weapon feeling cold and heavy despite the 98-degree humidity that glued his sweat-soaked fatigues to his skin. They were 20 meters from the clearing, the emergency LZ, and the extraction was supposed to be hot in T-minus 5 minutes. But the jungle wasn't playing its part. It was silent, too silent. This sector of I-Corps, deep in the A Shau Valley, was supposed to be humming with insects, chirping monkeys, or at the very least, the faint, maddening drip of condensation falling from the triple canopy. Instead, there was a vacuum, a terrifying absence of life that screamed danger louder than any mortar round. Ghost watched Harris, the point man and RTO, shifting his weight slightly, the heavy frame of the PRC-25 radio humping his back like a burdensome shadow. Harris was young, maybe 19, his face a map of fresh acne and high anxiety. He didn't look back. He was focused entirely on the emerald wall ahead, his M-16 held tight across his chest, the sling cutting into his neck. Ghost knew Harris was counting steps, just like he was, waiting for the familiar relief of open sky. Behind Ghost was Doc Reyes, the medic, a man whose quiet intensity was more unnerving than Bull's brute size. Doc carried the scent of iodine and something else, a perpetual scent of fear, managed but never conquered. And last, securing the rear, was Corporal Kowski, Bull, a mountain of a man who looked like he should be pulling stumps, not crawling through rot. Bull's M-60 rested in the muck, a gleaming, sinister beast of scorched metal and oil, ready to unleash hell. They had successfully tagged the largest NVA supply cache they had ever seen. Crates of AKs, mortar rounds, cases of rice, all hidden beneath a false rice paddy cover. They had taken photos, marked coordinates, and now they were leaving. Too easy. That thought, too easy, was the last coherent thought Ghost had before the small, innocuous sound detonated the world. It wasn't a shot. It was the faint, wet crunch of a boot heel stepping on a section of loose bamboo that had been deliberately placed as an early warning system. Ghost's mouth opened to hiss down, but the word never formed. The jungle erupted instantly, transitioning from absolute, paralyzing silence to a deafening, metallic scream in less than a heartbeat. It wasn't one shot. It was a wall of fire, concentrated and aimed directly at the center of their patrol. The initial volley was not small arms fire, but the catastrophic concussive roar of a command-detonated M-16 Claymore mine, packed with 700 steel balls and aimed at hip level. It ripped through the immediate foreground, followed instantly by the staccato thumping of 2 RPD light machine guns that stitched a terrifying line of tracers just above Ghost's head. The force of the Claymore threw Harris forward and sideways, folding his body around the radio pack like discarded wrapping paper. Ghost felt the shrapnel was past his ear, tasting the coppery tang of pulverized soil and freshly spilled blood instantly coating his lips. He was deafened, the world reduced to a violent, high-pitched ringing that made his skull ache. Instinct took over, raw and unthinking. Ghost didn't analyze, he reacted. He rolled hard, finding the meager cover behind the slick, root-gnarled base of a massive ironwood tree, simultaneously ripping a fragmentation grenade from his webbing. Bull, the rear security, reacted with magnificent, terrible speed. While Ghost was still orienting, Bull unleashed the M-60. The sound was immense, a primal, sustained roar that swallowed the NVA's initial assault, spitting out 500 rounds a minute of concentrated death. That was the M-16 scream, the combined noise of American automatic fire pushing back against the jungle's wrath. Doc Reyes, only 3 feet behind Ghost, slammed his body into the mud, clutching his medical bag like a lifeline. He tried to call out Harris's name, but the sound died in his throat, choked by the sheer noise. He saw Harris's position, the mangled remains barely identifiable, the PRC-25 25, sending out a pathetic squelch of static that indicated a severed line. The NVA's plan was brilliant and terrifyingly precise. They had waited until Viper was directly in the kill zone, perhaps having watched them for hours. They weren't just ambushing them, they were trying to annihilate them in the first 90 seconds. Ghost pulled the pin on the grenade and lobbed it blindly toward the densest sound of the RPD, counting 1001, 1002. The grenade wasn't meant to kill everyone, but to disrupt the rhythm of the ambush, to make the NVA drop their heads. When it blew, the momentary lull was filled only by the smoking, stuttering chaos of Bull's M-16, which sounded like a jackhammer chewing concrete. Ghost screamed, the sound lost even to his own ears, signaling Doc to crawl forward. They had to assess Harris, but more importantly, they had to recover the maps and the primary radio. They were blind and exposed, pinned down 20 meters from salvation, and the NVA was closing in fast, their screams and whistles blending into the cacophony of incoming rounds. Doc Reyes felt the cold, hard reality of absolute triumph settle over him like a suffocating shroud. He knew, before he even saw the full extent of the damage, that Harris was gone. The Claymore was a butcher's tool, yet the training dictated he confirm it, as Ghost provided covering fire, short, controlled bursts designed to conserve the rapidly dwindling ammo supply. Doc low-crawled toward the wreckage that had been their point man. The mud was thick and cold, smelling of ammonia and pulverized plant life, now increasingly layered with the sickly sweet scent of fresh blood. The earth was being churned by incoming rounds. Every few seconds, a chunk of bark exploded nearby, spraying splinters and humid air. Doc reached Harris's position, his stomach clenching violently. Harris's eyes were wide open, fixed on the canopy, but there was no life there, only the vacant shock of a sudden, brutal end. More critically, the PRC-25 radio was shattered, the green casing cracked open, its antenna bent into a grotesque zigzag, completely useless. The NVA knew exactly what they were doing: eliminate the point, eliminate communication, trap the survivors. Doc quickly and brutally searched the pack for the secondary emergency radio, the small, backup URC-68, but the entire pack was riddled with shrapnel and bullet holes. Any communication device was scrap metal. He took Harris's maps, folded tightly inside a waterproof pouch, and shoved them deep into his own trousers. He looked back at Ghost, shaking his head once, a subtle movement that carried the weight of the war itself. They were on their own. The ambush wasn't slowing, it was consolidating. The NVA had shifted from the initial, broad attack to concentrated flanking fire, attempting to encircle Bull and Ghost. The sheer volume of fire Bull was putting out with the M60 was keeping them alive, but Bull couldn't maintain that rate forever, not in this heat, and not with the finite supply of Link 7.62 rounds. Doc realized the 15-minute clock wasn't ticking toward extraction, but toward annihilation. 15 minutes of this intensity meant 0 survivors. He crawled back to Ghost, reporting the grim findings in clipped, breathless whispers. Harris down. Radio dead. We're deaf. Ghost merely nodded, his eyes narrowed, calculating the angles. His face was streaked with mud and powder residue, making him look less like a soldier and more like a mud statue animated by pure hatred and fear. They had to punch out, and the only way was forward through the mouth of the trap, toward the small clearing that felt a million miles away. The waiting was over. Now the fighting for survival had begun in earnest. Ghost knew the immediate calculus of their situation was simple. 3 men, maybe 5 full belts left for the M60, and 300 rounds apiece for the M16s, against an estimated squad plus of highly motivated NVA regulars. Maybe 12 to 15 men. Their advantage, firepower, was being rapidly negated by the NVA's superior positioning and overwhelming numbers. The NVA had a perfect crossfire established along the trail, forcing Bull to focus straight ahead, creating a vulnerability on their left flank. Ghost watched the tracer rounds chewing the dirt near Doc's elbow. He slapped Doc on the shoulder, pointing with 2 fingers to the left. The signal was clear: frag, smoke, and move. Doc pulled 2 M-16 smoke grenades, one violet, one green, and yanked the pins. The thick, sickly sweet plumes instantly billowed, mixing with the heavy jungle air, creating a disorienting, toxic fog that began to spread. This was Ghost's signature move, creating temporary, blinding chaos to cover a desperate movement. While the smoke deployed, obscuring the NVA sight lines, Ghost rolled onto his back and emptied a magazine toward the flank where the fire was heaviest, then quickly reloaded. The M-16 felt like a toy compared to Bull's weapon, but its precision was what mattered now. He focused on the muzzle flashes, tiny pinpricks of violent light that betrayed the enemy's position, and put 2 rounds into each flash he saw. He had to be ruthless now, eliminating threats, not suppressing them. The decision regarding Harris was made. Retrieval was impossible without sacrificing the remaining 3. Ghost felt the cold burn of that necessary sacrifice, a necessary inhumanity that the war demanded of its leaders. He yelled, his voice raw, even though he couldn't hear it over the noise. Bull, 20 meters forward. Large root cluster. Go. Bull understood. He stopped firing the M-16 mid-belt. The barrel, smoking furiously, yanked the bipod clear of the mud and began to crab walk forward, dragging the monstrous weapon and its ammo belts behind him. The smoke was their only shield, but the NVA were already shooting through it, blind firing with remarkable accuracy, hoping to catch the sound of their movement. Ghost and Doc laid down, covering fire, pouring rounds into the opaque purple cloud. This was the most vulnerable part of the ambush, moving from cover to cover. Ghost focused on the movement of the ferns ahead, watching for the shape of an advancing enemy soldier. He knew that if the NVA realized they were pulling back toward the LZ, they would shift their flanking maneuver to cut them off entirely. They had to move fast, violently, and without hesitation. Every second counted. The air felt thick and heavy, saturated with the metallic taste of burnt powder and adrenaline. The 20-meter push felt like traversing a kilometer of glass shards. They moved in staggered bounds, Bull first, then Doc, then Ghost, each man covering the last, their movements fueled purely by survival instinct and muscle memory. When Bull finally reached the massive, exposed root system that offered concrete cover, he dropped the M-60, reloading a fresh 100-round belt with hands shaking violently, not from fear, but from exhaustion and the scorching heat of the barrel. He ignored the smell of his own flesh momentarily searing as he grasped the foregrip. They were briefly, desperately safe beneath the roots, but they were still in the kill zone, the concentrated fire hitting the ironwood roots, spraying dust and splinters around them. Ghost dropped beside Bull, checking his ammo status, down to 2 magazines. Doc was already scanning Bull for wounds, his face pale beneath the grime. They had maybe 8 minutes left before the NVA reorganized, or simply flanked them and launched a coordinated human wave attack. Ghost took a deep, rattling breath, the air burning his lungs. The reality of their position was stark. They were survivors, but survival felt less like a victory and more like a temporary delay of execution. He looked at Bull, whose eyes were wide and red-rimmed, focused entirely on the empty space where the enemy was hiding. He saw the primal, animal focus in Bull, the transformation from Corporal Kowski to a desperate, killing machine driven solely by the will to live. Bull was functioning on a layer of consciousness stripped bare of civilization or duty, fueled by the sheer terror of not making it home. Ghost found himself asking a question, silently, intensely, that often haunted him during the lulls. When the smoke clears and the duty is stripped away, what remains? Is the relentless, desperate will to survive, to push past the limits of human endurance, inherently a selfish act? Or is the ultimate act of selflessness the survival of the squad, regardless of the cost to the individual soul? I wonder, for those of you watching who have faced true moments of life or death crisis, where did you draw the line between instinctual self-preservation and protecting those around you? Was the drive to survive for yourself or for them? Share your thoughts on that duality below. because out here, that line vanishes entirely. Ghost didn't wait for an answer. He saw movement just beyond the smoke cloud, a dark shape low to the ground, trying to crawl past the roots and get behind them. The NVA were adjusting their strategy, attempting to cut off their line of retreat to the LZ. Time was truly running out. The 15-minute ambush was entering its bloodiest phase. The dark shape proved to be a young NVA soldier, armed with a rifle and a satchel of grenades, trying to exploit the smoke cover. Ghost reacted instantly, not with the M-16, but with his sidearm, the .45 caliber M-1911. The close range demanded something quicker, heavier, and less likely to jam in the mud and grime. The sound of the .45 was a heavy thud compared to the cracking whip of the M16s, and it struck the target with brutal finality. But the momentary silence caused by the kill was shattered immediately by more movement. They weren't alone. The NVA were now committing to close-quarters engagement, realizing the Americans were too heavily fortified to dislodge with fire alone. Two more soldiers burst through the thinning purple smoke, screaming in Vietnamese, their bayonets fixed. This was the moment of complete, unholy fusion between the silent jungle and the M-16 scream. The fight had come down to meters, to breath, to steel on bone. Bull, still covered by the root system, swung the M-60 up, firing a burst that shredded the leading NVA soldier, the high rate of fire turning the man into confetti before he could even register the threat. But the second soldier was faster, launching himself at Ghost. Ghost dropped the .45, ripping his K-bar combat knife free, the blade already slick with jungle humidity. The fight was quick and sickeningly intimate. The man lunged, the bayonet aimed for Ghost's chest. Ghost twisted, catching the NVA rifle stock on his shoulder, driving his knife upward and feeling the horrible, grinding resistance of cartilage and muscle. He disengaged instantly, not lingering, already scanning for the next threat. Doc Reyes, meanwhile, had found himself out of M-16 ammo. He dropped the useless weapon, grabbed the heavy machete he used for trail clearing, and watched as a soldier attempted to flank Bull. Doc didn't hesitate. He rose from the dirt, letting out a war cry that was more shock than battle rage, and brought the heavy blade down in a wide, sweeping arc. The sheer shock of the attack, a man appearing from the earth and swinging a massive jungle tool, made the NVA soldier hesitate for a critical second. The machete bit deep. Doc didn't look back. He grabbed the NVA soldier's dropped AK-47, checked the magazine, and started firing blindly into the smoke, adding more chaos to the already suffocating atmosphere. They were surviving this not through superior tactics, but through desperate, brutal violence and sheer refusal to die. The clock in Ghost's mind hit 7 minutes. They had to stop engaging and start running. The sheer weight of enemy bodies accumulating around the root system signaled that the NVA leadership was willing to sacrifice men to contain them. Ghost knew that continuing the close-quarters fight was suicide. They had to make the NVA pause, had to create a distraction so monumental that it would break the enemy's concentration long enough for a dash to the clearing. He pulled a massive NM-14TH-3 incendiary grenade, a thermite grenade, designed to burn at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It was not a tactical weapon, but a demolition tool used to destroy equipment caches, and the fire it created was impossible to ignore. He pulled the pin, waited 2 seconds, and hurled it into the thickest concentration of enemy fire, just beyond the body of the NVA soldier Doc had macheted. Simultaneously, he reached into the small radio pouch he carried and pulled out the emergency signaling flare, a high-altitude red star cluster. This was the Hail Mary. If they popped the flare and signaled their precise location to the distant artillery base, they were essentially marking themselves as Target Zero. It was the only way to break contact and clean the field enough for extraction. He keyed his survival radio, which was still working, setting the emergency frequency, and screamed the coordinates of their current position, the root cluster, and the word danger close. Danger close. Repeat fire mission Bravo. The thermite grenade erupted, not with a bang, but with a terrifying, hissing roar, instantly vaporizing the jungle floor in its vicinity, creating an expanding circle of white-hot, furious heat. The NVA screamed, not from being hit, but from the sudden, apocalyptic burst of light and heat that burned their eyes and lungs. Ghost popped the flare, sending the brilliant red light cutting vertically through the thick canopy, a beacon of hope and imminent death. Now they had 3 minutes, maybe less. Artillery would not hesitate. They would drop the shells precisely on the flare's point of origin. They had to abandon the cover of the roots, abandoning the brief safety Bull had afforded them. They heard the faint, high-pitched whistling of the incoming rounds before they heard the boom. The NVA heard it too. Their sustained fire instantly slackened as the soldiers realized the Americans had called in the hammer. The 15-minute ambush was turning into a desperate race against friendly fire, a horrifying gamble where the cure was almost as deadly as the disease. The first 105mm round landed about 30 meters behind them, shaking the earth with an immense, primordial shudder. The sound was a crushing, overwhelming pressure wave that stole the air from their lungs and amplified the ringing in Ghost's ears to a debilitating shriek. The shock wave slammed the 3 men against the roots. Before the dust and pulverized debris could settle, a second round impacted, closer this time, just 15 meters to their left, where the flanking fire had been concentrated. The jungle trees, immense and ancient, shuddered and fell, snapping like matchsticks. The air filled with the acrid, metallic smell of cordite and high explosives. Ghost didn't wait for the third round. He grabbed Bull, who was momentarily stunned, holding his side where a large piece of shrapnel had torn through his webbing and into his flesh. Bull, move. Now! Ghost screamed, the sound a ragged wheeze. They didn't run. They scrambled, stumbling over fallen branches and freshly turned earth, trying to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the incoming barrage that was ripping apart the landscape they had just survived. Doc Reyes was fully focused on keeping Bull upright, dragging the massive man, despite the M-16 still clutched in Bull's hand. The NVA's organized attack was completely shattered. They were scattered, dead, or fleeing the incoming artillery. For a terrifying minute, the greatest threat wasn't the enemy, but the enormous kinetic force of the American military response. Ghost knew the artillery spotter would only walk the rounds toward them if they didn't continue signaling. He keyed the survival radio again, fighting the nausea and vertigo caused by the blasts. Shift fire. North 50. We are breaking contact. He waited, desperately praying the transmission got through. They couldn't stop moving. The adrenaline was running out, replaced by the crushing weight of exhaustion and the pain of dozens of small cuts and bruises. The jungle floor was now slick with thick mud and scattered debris, making every step treacherous. They moved forward toward the clearing, toward the extraction point that was now less than 50 meters away. The 15-minute ambush had been absolute, distilled nightmare of sensory overload, culminating in the earth-shattering chaos of the artillery fire. The clock was ticking toward the end of their ordeal, but the mental damage had already been done. Every step was a step away from Harris, a step into a silence that would forever be poisoned by memory. They burst through the final line of dense foliage and into the small, humid clearing, the designated LZ. It was overgrown, sloppy, and terrifyingly exposed. Ghost dropped to his knees, utterly spent, his chest heaving, his M-16 instinctively pointed toward the surrounding tree line, expecting the ambush to spring a third time. But the artillery barrage had done its job. The immediate jungle surrounding the clearing was now utterly silent. Not the deceptive, anticipatory silence they had encountered before the ambush, but a heavy, profound silence, weighted down by death, shock, and smoke. The sound of the explosions was fading, replaced by the persistent, painful ringing in their ears. Doc Reyes carefully laid Bull down, tearing away the blood-soaked fatigued pant leg to examine the shrapnel wound. Deep, but not immediately fatal. thankfully missing the bone. Ghost pulled the smoke grenade from his pouch, yellow, and popped it, throwing it out into the center of the clearing, marking the LZ for the extraction chopper that was supposed to be inbound. The yellow smoke drifted lazily in the still air. The transition from the deafening, visceral combat of the last 15 minutes back to this oppressive quiet was almost worse than the fight itself. The silence allowed the human mind to reboot, to process the horrors, the sounds of men dying, the smell of burnt flesh. The cost of their survival settled over Ghost like a physical weight. Harris was gone. They had abandoned him and the primary radio. They had survived, but at a terrible, immediate price. Ghost looked back at the tree line, which now seemed impossibly thick and dark. He knew the NVA would be reforming, licking their wounds, waiting. The Huey had to get there fast. He checked his watch. 25 minutes had passed since they stepped on that fateful bamboo stalk. The 15-minute ambush was long over, but the consequence of that time was now indelible, etched into their memory, their bodies, and the jungle floor itself. They sat, three broken, muddied statues of men, waiting for the sound of salvation. The salvation came in the form of a faint, growing whoop 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 that cut through the oppressive silence, the distinctive sound of a Huey slick, their extraction bird, designated dust-off. The sound grew louder, shaking the canopy above them as the chopper approached the yellow smoke. The noise was violent, intrusive, yet incredibly beautiful, the sound of freedom and survival. Ghost grabbed the small survival radio one last time, confirming the bird's identity and safety, giving the all-clear for landing. The Huey descended rapidly, kicking up a massive vortex of pulverized dirt, leaves, and smoke that engulfed the clearing. The crew chief, a young man with safety goggles, leaned out, pointing frantically toward the wounded bull. Doc Reyes, driven by a sudden surge of exhausted energy, began pulling Bull toward the open bay of the helicopter. Ghost provided the last, agonizing piece of security, scanning the tree line as the dust storm whipped around him, his heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs. He saw nothing. The NVA had retreated, choosing not to challenge the helicopter's arrival. As he climbed aboard last, the smell of aviation fuel, hot hydraulic fluid, and clean metal was a stark, almost sterile contrast to the rot and gore they had been submerged in. The doors slammed shut, and the Huey tilted, ascending rapidly, tearing them out of the green hell. Ghost looked down through the open bay at the clearing, rapidly shrinking below the rotor wash, marking the spot where Harris still lay. The jungle, now viewed from above, looked deceptively peaceful, an endless, deep emerald ocean that hid its deadly secrets perfectly. He met Doc's eyes across the cabin, the medic already working furiously on Bull, securing the bandages, administering morphine. There was no exchange of words, none were necessary. They had crossed a boundary together in those 15 minutes of absolute chaos, a shared trauma that bound them tighter than any official military oath. Survival wasn't a triumph. It was a debt owed to the dead, a burden of memory and sacrifice. Ghost closed his eyes, the high-pitched ringing in his ears slowly being drowned out by the comforting roar of the turbine. But the memory of the jungle silence and the M-16 scream would never leave him. If this story, this glimpse into the brutal duality of survival and sacrifice in the Vietnam War, resonated with you, and if you seek to understand the untold costs carried by the men who fought there, please subscribe to Echoes from Vietnam. Your support helps us ensure these vital, intense, and often painful stories of duty, brotherhood, and disillusionment are never lost to time. Thank you for watching, and may the echoes of the past guide your future understanding.